You know, there's a very specific trap that I think a lot of people fall into when they first start studying human behavior.
Oh, definitely. There are a few, actually.
Right, but I mean, this intrinsic, like almost biological assumption we have that our eyes are objective video cameras.
Oh, yeah. The idea that seeing is believing.
Exactly. It's a huge misconception, but it's incredibly pervasive.
Hmm.
People just think that if you watch a behavior happen long enough, if you just stare at a situation with enough focus, you'll eventually know exactly why that behavior is happening.
Yeah, they treat it like a medical diagnosis.
Right. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows the jagged white line, the doctor points to the film and says, like, there's the break, and everyone goes home happy. We really want behavior to be that clean.
We do, but I mean, that desire for clean, binary answers is exactly what gets practitioners into trouble.
Because it's never that simple, right?
No, not at all. Behavior isn't a static bone fracture that you can just capture on a piece of film. It's dynamic, it's heavily context-dependent, and it's fluid. Relying strictly on observation, like just watching a situation unfold and trusting your gut interpretation, is arguably one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in applied behavior analysis.
Which is wild to think about because observation is so important.
Observation is vital, certainly, but observation alone, it only hands you a pattern. It provides circumstantial evidence.
That's just clues.
Exactly. It absolutely does not give you the scientific proof of why something is happening. To get to that undeniable, empirically valid function of the behavior, you can't just be a passive observer. You actually have to systematically manipulate the environment to test your hypothesis.
And that transition, going from a passive observer to an active participant in a highly controlled scientific process, that is exactly what we are breaking down today.
It's the core of everything we do.
It really is. We're exploring the exact science of how we uncover the why behind behavior, and specifically the critical role you play in that assessment process. So welcome to this deep dive of behavioral intelligence con Mara Sánchez, powered by Amethyst Therapy Services.
Glad to be here for this one.
We know you are out there in the field, likely navigating these exact scenarios, so we're kind of bypassing the basic definitions today and getting straight into the clinical realities.
Right, and just to contextualize our mission for today, this deep dive is a dedicated component of our complete RBT task list series.
Yes, very important context.
We're tackling task list item B.3, which requires a practitioner to, and I quote, participate in components of functional assessment procedures.
Which sounds so simple on paper.
Oh, it always does. But our focus today is to really dissect what that participation actually looks like under the pressure of real-world environment.
Like when things are actually chaotic.
Exactly. Unpacking the nuances of descriptive assessments versus functional analyses and exploring the psychological and, environmental variables that just completely complicate this process.
So let's start with the stakes, because I want to establish why mastering this specific skill isn't just like an academic exercise for an exam. It's a clinical imperative.
Absolutely. The stakes are huge for the client.
Yeah, so why is the RBT's mastery of data collection during assessments so heavily scrutinized? I mean, if the supervising BCBA is the one designing the assessment and ultimately you're writing the behavior intervention plan, why can't they just handle the entire assessment phase themselves?
No, it really comes down to ecological validity.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So a BCBA can certainly come in and do an observation, right?
Right?
But they are a novel variable in that environment.
Oh, for sure, the clipboard effect.
The clipboard effect. When a supervisor with a clipboard walks into a classroom or a home, the environment inherently changes. This is known as reactivity.
People act differently when they know they're being watched.
Exactly. The client acts differently, the teachers act differently, the parents act differently. But you, as the RBT, you are the constant.
Because you're there every day?
You're embedded in the natural environment.
Yeah.
You're spending hundreds of hours with the client. So you're the one who sees those subtle setting events like the lack of sleep from the night before, or a slight change in a parent's tone of voice.
Or even just like the ambient noise in a busy clinic.
Right. And without your real-time, highly objective data, the BCBA is essentially attempting to solve a 1,000-piece puzzle with half the pieces missing. They're relying entirely on you to capture the environmental realities that they simply aren't present to see.
So the intervention is really only as good as the assessment it's built on. If the data is flawed, the hypothesized function is flawed, and the intervention could actually backfire.
It will almost certainly backfire. I mean, let's look at the neurological and behavioral fallout of a mismatched intervention.
Okay, give me a scenario.
Suppose an RBT's observational data suggests a client is engaging in severe vocal stereotypy, like loud shouting, because they want attention.
Okay, pretty common hypothesis.
Right. So the BCBA designs a plan based on that data,
Yeah.
and they implement an attention extinction protocol. The instruction to the team is to completely ignore the shouting.
Makes sense if it's for attention.
But what if the data was flawed, and the shouting wasn't socially mediated at all? What if the client is experiencing internal pain, like a severe ear infection, or they're highly sensitive to the fluorescent lights in the room?
Oh, wow. So the shouting is actually automaton negative reinforcement.
Yeah, it's a way to block out the aversive sensory input.
And by ignoring them, you aren't just failing to treat the behavior, you're actively leaving them in a state of distress.
Exactly. You are withdrawing support when they're trying to escape an aversive stimulus.
Which is heartbreaking, really.
It is. You're mismatching the treatment to the true function. And not only does the behavior fail to improve, but you might actually inadvertently cause an escalation.
Because they're still in pain and nobody is helping.
Right, so perhaps the shouting turns into self-injurious behavior because the client's fundamental need isn't being met. This is exactly why supervisors are incredibly rigorous about this.
They need the data to be bulletproof.
They expect data that is completely stripped of personal bias. And, from a credentialing standpoint, understanding the rigid boundaries of your role in this process is one of the most heavily tested concepts you'll face on the exam.
You really have to know the precise limits of your clinical authority.
You do.
Which sets up a perfect transition to the official parameters. Task B.3 explicitly states again, participate in components of functional assessment procedures. For example, descriptive assessment, functional analysis.
Right.
I really want to pause on that word participate because, like in everyday language, participating can mean taking charge or jumping in and leading a project.
Oh, definitely, like participating in a group project at school.
Exactly. But in our field, that word has a very strict legal and ethical boundary.
The terminology here is incredibly deliberate. So a functional behavior assessment, or FBA, is a comprehensive, systematic process used to identify the variables, the antecedents, and consequences that reliably predict and maintain problem behavior.
It's the gold standard for figuring out the why.
It is. But the RBT's scope of practice dictates that your role is strictly supportive. Participating means you are the instrument of data collection.
You're gathering the empirical evidence.
Yes. If properly trained, you might even act as the confederate in an experimental condition, delivering specific prompts or consequences. But participating never, ever means you are designing the test conditions.
Right. You don't make the plan.
And it never means you are looking at the graph data and concluding, this behavior is maintained by access to tangibles. The diagnostic interpretation and the procedural design are the exclusive domain of the behavior analyst.
Okay, let's pull this apart and look at the actual architecture of an FBA. We're going to go tier by tier.
Sounds good.
How do we start building the case? Like, what is the entry point when we have a novel behavior we need to assess?
So the entry point is almost always what we call the indirect assessment. This is the first tier of the FBA process.
Indirect, which inherently means we're deliberately choosing not to look at the behavior yet. Like we're standing outside the room, so to speak.
That is a really great way to visualize it. Indirect functional assessment methods involve gathering historical information and contextual data without ever directly observing the target behavior in real time.
So no ABC data yet.
Right. No live data. You are leaning entirely on the subjective recollection of the people who interact with the clients, the teachers, the caregivers, and sometimes the clients themselves.
What does that look like practically? Are we just having a casual conversation with the parents over coffee and asking, hey, why do you think he does this?
It's far more structured than a casual conversation.
Right.
We use standardized tools, structured interviews, rating scales, and specific questionnaires.
Okay, so it's formal.
Yes. The Cooper text highlights several validated instruments, like the Functional Analysis Screening Tool, which we call the FAST, or the Questions About Behavioral Function Scale, the QABF.
I've definitely seen those used in the field.
Yeah, they're everywhere. These tools are designed to systematically probe different potential functions. They ask very targeted questions like, does the behavior usually occur when you are busy doing something else?
Right.
Or does the behavior stop immediately when you give the person what they asked for?
Okay, I want to challenge the utility of this for a moment.
Go for it.
Because we just spent the entire opening of this deep dive talking about how human observation is flawed and biased.
We did.
If we know that a parent who has been dealing with severe tantrums for 3 years is Exhausted, emotional, and likely experiencing a massive amount of recency bias, meaning they only remember the terrible tantrum from yesterday, not the baseline behavior from a week ago. Why do we even bother with indirect assessments? Aren't we just collecting flawed data?
That is a phenomenal point, and it targets the exact weakness of indirect assessments. The data is absolutely vulnerable to observer bias,
Yeah.
memory decay, and just general emotional fatigue.
Right. A parent might say, he hits me all the time for absolutely no reason.
Exactly. And as behavior analysts, we know there's always a reason, and it rarely happens all the time. However, we don't use indirect assessments to prove the function.
So what's the goal then?
We use them to build the initial hypothesis. Gives us a starting point. If 3 different teachers fill out a rating scale, and all their answers strongly point toward escape from academic demands, the BCBA now has a targeted direction for the next phase of the assessment.
That makes a lot of sense. It narrows the field.
Right. And additionally, from a purely clinical relationship standpoint, sitting down with a family and just listening to their history builds critical rapport.
Oh, that's so true. It validates their struggle.
It validates what they're going through before we start implementing rigorous, cold scientific testing.
So just to clarify the RBT's role here, the RBT is not administering these rating scales, right? The BCBA handles the FAST and the QABF.
Correct.
But the RBT might be interviewed, right? Because the RBT is a primary caregiver in that therapeutic environment.
Exactly. The BCBA might sit down with you and conduct a structured interview based on your historical knowledge of the client. You're providing data based on your memory of past sessions.
Got it.
It's vital information, but it remains classified as indirect because it's a retroactive account, not a live, concurrent observation.
Okay, so the interviews are done. We have a rough hypothesis. Let's say the caregivers think the behavior is happening because the client wants to escape a task. We take that hypothesis and move to Tier 2, the descriptive assessment, which is also known as the direct assessment.
Yes. This is where we move out of the realm of memory and into the realm of real-time observation.
Finally getting our eyes on it.
Exactly. A descriptive assessment involves directly observing the individual in their natural environment, whether that's the classroom, the grocery store, the clinic, or the home. We are no longer asking what happened yesterday. We are watching what is happening right now.
And this is the domain of ABC data, antecedent, behavior, consequence. I mean, this is the bread and butter of the RBT's daily life.
It is the foundational metric of our field. As the behavior unfolds organically, the RBT collects continuous narrative or structured data.
So they're capturing the sequence.
Right, you're documenting the exact environmental conditions immediately preceding the behavior of the antecedent. You are recording an objective, measurable description of the behavior itself. And you are documenting the environmental changes that immediately follow the behavior, the consequence.
But the key here, and this is where I think people get really tripped up, is that during a descriptive assessment, we are not actively changing the environment.
Not at all.
We're not setting up a test condition. We are just watching the natural ecosystem operate.
That is the defining characteristic of a descriptive assessment. You are a passive documentarian. You observe events that are not arranged in any systematic manner. You do not contrive the situation.
So whatever happens, happens.
Yes. If the teacher yells, you document it. If a peer steals a toy, you document it.
Okay, here's where the confusion sets in for a lot of practitioners. Let's walk through a scenario. Let's say I'm an RBT in a middle school. I'm shadowing a client. The math teacher hands out a worksheet. The client immediately flips their desk. The teacher sends the client to the principal's office.
Classic antecedent behavior consequence.
Right. And this exact sequence happens on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Math worksheet desk flip sent to the office. The pattern is glaringly obvious. To any rational human being, that confirms the function is escape from math.
It certainly looks that way.
So why does the scientific community say that this descriptive data does not confirm the function?
Because you're conflating correlation with causation. And honestly, this is the single biggest conceptual hurdle in behavior analysis.
Break that down for us.
Okay, so a correlation means that 2 events reliably co-occur in time. The math worksheet and the desk flipping happen together.
Right.
Causation means that one event directly and exclusively triggers the other. While your ABC data shows a powerful pattern, a descriptive assessment cannot control for hidden variables.
Okay, give me an example of a hidden variable that would completely derail my assumption about the math worksheet.
Let's look at the broader context of that middle school environment. What if, right before math class every single day, the client has physical education, and they're physically exhausted and dysregulated?
Oh, so the antecedent isn't really the math, it's the state they're in.
Right. Or what if the peer who sits next to the client in math class quietly whispers threats to them, and flipping the desk is actually an attempt to escape the peer, not the math worksheet?
Wow, I wouldn't even see that as an observer.
Exactly. Or, here's another one, what if the client actually loves math, but they know that flipping the desk gets them sent to the principal's office, and the principal's office has a very comfortable couch, air conditioning, and a secretary who gives them undivided attention?
Ah. So if the secretary is giving them attention, the function might actually be socially mediated positive reinforcement access to attention rather than negative reinforcement escape from math.
Precisely. If you just look at the antecedent of the worksheet and the behavior of the desk flip, you completely miss the delayed consequence of the secretary's attention.
That's wild.
Descriptive assessments are highly susceptible to false positives because natural environments are chaotic. There are thousands of stimuli occurring simultaneously. As the Cooper text meticulously outlines, descriptive assessments can only yield correlational data.
So they generate robust hypotheses, but they cannot definitively confirm the functional relation.
Exactly. To achieve absolute scientific certainty, we have to move to the third and final tier.
Tier 3, the functional analysis, the FA. This is where we stop watching the environment and start controlling it.
The FA is the true experimental phase.
Yeah.
It's the only assessment method that allows practitioners to definitively demonstrate a cause and effect relationship.
Because we're actually isolating variables.
Yes. In a functional analysis, the behavior analyst systematically manipulates antecedents and consequences within a highly controlled experimental design. We intentionally turn the natural environment into a temporary laboratory.
We're essentially stress testing our hypotheses. If we think the behavior is happening for attention, we're going to intentionally create a situation to prove or disprove that.
Exactly.
Let's walk through the architecture of a standard FA, because understanding these conditions is critical for an RBT who might be asked to help run them.
So a traditional functional analysis, heavily based on the foundational research of Brian Iwata in the early 80s, typically consists of 4 distinct conditions. 3 of these are test conditions designed to evoke the behavior, and 1 is a control condition.
Let's start with the first test condition, contingent attention. What is the psychological mechanism we are testing here, and how is it actually structured?
The contingent attention condition tests whether the problem behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement specifically, attention from others. The setup involves bringing the client into a room and giving them access to moderately preferred items.
Okay.
However, the therapist intentionally withdraws their attention. They might sit in the corner and pretend to read a book or do paperwork, completely ignoring the client.
So we are intentionally creating a state of deprivation. We're starving them of attention to see what they do.
Exactly. We are creating and establishing operation. If the client engages in the target behavior, let's say they start banging their head on the wall, the therapist immediately provides contingent attention.
What does that look like?
The therapist walks over and says, "Oh no, please don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself," maybe rubbing their back or holding their hands. Then the therapist goes right back to ignoring them.
Just immediately cuts off the attention again.
Right. And if the data shows a massive spike in head banging during this specific condition compared to the others, we have scientifically proven that the behavior is a functional tool used to solicit attention.
And what is really fascinating about that is the topography of the attention doesn't even have to be positive. A reprimand, a sigh, a stern stop it, all of that functions as attention.
To a nervous system starved for connection, any social interaction can function as a reinforcer, even if it looks like punishment to an outside observer.
Okay, let's move to the second condition. Contingent escape. What does this look like?
This condition tests for social negative reinforcement. We're asking, does this behavior serve to terminate or delay an aversive demand?
Right.
In this setup, the therapist presents continuous, non-preferred learning trials. You sit the client down and demand that they sort complex stimuli or complete difficult math problems, prompting them continuously.
You are intentionally applying pressure. You are turning up the heat.
You are creating a highly aversive environment. If the client engages in the target behavior, say, they swipe the materials off the table, the therapist immediately removes the demands.
So they back off completely.
Right. The therapist says, "Okay, you don't have to do this right now," turns away, and gives the client a 30-second break. No demands, no eye contact. After 30 seconds, the demands resume.
And if they swipe the materials again?
You repeat the break. If the problem behavior occurs frequently in this condition, it confirms the function is escape.
I want to pause here because this highlights the emotional toll on the RBT. If you are the RPP running this condition, it feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It really does.
Because your instinct as a compassionate human being is to comfort a frustrated child or to gently guide them through the task. But in an FA, you are required to act almost like a machine. You trigger the frustration, and when the behavior happens, you just back away. That requires incredible procedural discipline.
It requires an absolute suspension of your natural caregiving instincts. You have to maintain a neutral poker face.
Because if you react, you ruin the data.
Exactly. If you show emotion, if you accidentally deliver a reprimand during the escape condition, you have contaminated the data. You have mixed attention into an escape condition, and the results are ruined. That's why procedural integrity is so ruthlessly monitored during an FA.
Let's talk about the third condition, which I think is conceptually the hardest to grasp, the alone condition.
The alone condition tests for automatic reinforcement. This implies that the behavior itself produces internal sensory consequences that are reinforcing, completely independent of the social environment.
It doesn't rely on another human being delivering attention or removing a demand,
Right.
like scratching an itch. It feels good regardless of who is in the room. Or in the case of severe behavior, like the endorphin release from self-injurious behavior. But how do you test for something you can't even see?
You test for it by removing everything else. In the alone condition, the client is placed in a therapy room with a very low level of environmental stimulation.
So it's basically empty.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
No therapist is present in the room they are observing through a two-way mirror or via a camera. There are no task materials, no demands, and no access to preferred toys. It is a sterile environment.
And then you just watch.
You just watch. If the behavior continues to occur at high rates when the client is completely isolated, we can reasonably conclude that the behavior is producing its own internal reinforcement.
That is fascinating. By removing all external variables, you prove the internal variable. And then the fourth condition is the baseline, the control condition.
Often referred to as the play condition. In this setup, we expect the problem behavior to be practically non-existent. We saturate the environment with freely available reinforcement.
Just everything they could ever want.
Exactly. The client has their favorite toys, the therapist is delivering constant non-contingent positive attention, and there are absolutely zero demands placed on the client.
It's behavioral paradise.
It is. And we use this condition as the baseline comparison. If the behavior still occurs at high rates in the play condition, we have a highly complex case on our hands, potentially indicating automatic reinforcement, or a failure to properly identify what is actually reinforcing to that specific client.
To really anchor these three tiers, indirect, descriptive, and functional analysis, I want to frame this using a conceptual model. Let's use a criminal justice analogy. Let's look at the FBA process like a high-stakes police investigation.
Well, I like this, a behavioral detective story.
Precisely. Step 1, the indirect assessment. This is the equivalent of interviewing the witnesses after a bank has been robbed.
Okay.
The police arrive, and they start asking the tellers and the customers what happened. You get some critical clues. One witness says the suspect had a red jacket. Another says they drove a silver car.
But human memory is notoriously fragile.
Exactly. Witnesses are stressed. They suffer from observer bias. They accidentally invent details.
Yeah.
The interviews give the detectives a direction, but you cannot walk into a courtroom and ask a judge for a conviction based purely on witness interviews. It's necessary, but insufficient.
Right. You need physical observation.
Which brings us to step 2, the descriptive assessment. The detectives set up a snakeout. They park an unmarked van across the street from a suspect's house, and they use binoculars to watch in real time.
Taking their ABC data.
Yes. Antecedent. Suspect leaves house at midnight. Behavior. Suspect puts on a ski mask. Consequence. Suspect walks toward the bank. The pattern is incredibly compelling. The detectives are watching the ecosystem unfold naturally, but here's the catch. You still cannot arrest someone just for walking near a bank with a mask.
It's circumstantial evidence. It's just correlation.
They might just be very cold and going for a weird midnight walk.
A defense attorney would tear that apart in court. You haven't proven intent.
Exactly. To prove intent, to prove causation, you move to step 3, the functional analysis, the sting operation. The detectives stop passively watching and they intentionally manipulate the environment.
They leave the bank vault open on purpose.
Yes. They stack fake money on the counter. They intentionally create the establishing operation to see if the suspect takes the bait. When the suspect reaches for the money, the trap closes. By controlling the variables and measuring the exact response, you have undeniably proven the motive. You have experimental control.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the transition from subjective memory to objective correlation to experimental causation. And, it highlights why skipping straight to a treatment plan based on an interview is the equivalent of locking someone up based on a rumor.
Let's bring this out of the theoretical and into the practical reality of an RBT's workday. How does this actually look in the field? Let's take a scenario involving a descriptive assessment in a busy environment, like a public school.
Okay, imagine you are an RBT assigned to a child who engages in high rates of elopement, running away from their designated area. The BCBA has instructed you to collect continuous ABC data for a descriptive assessment. You are in the school cafeteria. It is loud, chaotic, and crowded.
A nightmare for data collection.
The ultimate test of your objectivity. Suddenly, a larger student bumps into your client's chair. The client screams, stands up, and sprints toward the exit doors. The cafeteria monitor blows a whistle, chases the client, and physically blocks the door, scolding the client loudly.
Now, as the RBT, my instinct is to intervene, to help the monitor, or to try and calm the client down. But my directive is data collection. What am I writing down?
Assuming the client is not in immediate life-threatening physical danger, your primary job is to document the sequence with microscopic precision. You do not intervene to alter the consequence because you are capturing the natural baseline. Your ABC data needs to be completely devoid of interpretation.
So what does that look like on paper?
Antecedent. Peer bumped into client's chair. Behavior. Client emitted loud vocalization, stood up, and ran 20 feet toward the exit. Consequence. Monitor blew whistle, blocked door, and delivered verbal reprimands.
It's very dry.
It has to be. You do not write, client was scared of the loud noise. You do not write, client tried to escape the bully. You document the observable physics of the situation.
Now let's contrast that passive data collection with an active FA in a clinic setting. Let's say the behavior is severe aggression, hitting and biting. The BCBA has deemed it safe enough to test in a controlled room, and they have trained you to run the conditions.
Okay, so the BCBA says, we are running the contingent attention condition. Here is a tablet. I want you to sit in the corner and look at the tablet. Completely ignore the client. If the client hits you or bites you, I want you to immediately look at them, put your hand on their shoulder and say, please don't hit me. We need to have safe hands. Then immediately look back at your tablet.
That requires nerves of steel, because you are sitting there knowing a physical strike is likely coming, and when it does, you have to deliver a perfectly calibrated, neutral response.
It's incredibly difficult.
You can't flinch, you can't yell in pain, you can't lecture them on safety. If you get angry and yell, you've just delivered an intense emotional reaction, which might be exactly what the client's behavior is designed to elicit. You've rewarded the behavior instead of just testing it.
This is exactly where we see the most critical errors in the field.
Yeah.
Which is a perfect segue to discuss the common mistakes RBTs make during the assessment process. Because human nature fights against the strict protocols of behavior analysis.
It really does.
The first, and arguably most pervasive mistake, is the use of mentalisms in data collection.
We mentioned this briefly, but let's dissect the psychology of a mentalism. Why are we so prone to doing this?
A mentalism is basically a linguistic trap. It is an explanation of behavior that points to internal, unobservable states as the cause. For example, writing, he threw the pencil because he was frustrated, or she cried because she felt ignored.
It's just how normal people talk.
Exactly. Humans are biologically wired with a theory of mind. We evolved to constantly guess what other people are thinking and feeling to survive in social groups. So when we see a child crying, our brain automatically leaps to the emotional narrative. They are sad.
We are fighting against our own evolutionary programming when we take ABC data.
We really are. But in behavior analysis, relying on a mentalism is fatal to the assessment. You cannot observe frustration. Frustration doesn't have a mass, a volume, or a duration. You can observe a furrowed brow. You can measure the decibel level of a scream. You can count the number of times a fist strikes a table. But the moment you write frustrated, you have stopped collecting data and started writing fiction based on your own internal biases.
You're jumping to the end.
You're assuming the function before the assessment is even complete. The supervisor cannot build a behavioral intervention on your assumption of sadness. They need the environmental facts.
The second major mistake is what I call rogue testing, or unauthorized procedural design.
This one is incredibly dangerous. Sometimes an experienced RBT who has a good grasp of behavioral principles gets impatient.
They think they know best.
Right. They see a behavior occurring, they form their own hypothesis, and they decide to test an intervention independently. They might think, I bet this crying is maintained by attention. I'm going to put it on extinction today and just ignore it to see what happens.
Oh, boy.
They implement a treatment procedure without the BCBA ever conducting an FBA or designing a plan.
I can see how an RBT might think they're being proactive, like they're trying to solve the problem quickly. But what is the fallout of that?
The fallout can be catastrophic. If you independently implement attention extinction, completely ignoring the crying, but the true unidentified function of the behavior is actually escape from a demand, you are entirely mismatching the environment.
Because by ignoring them, you might inadvertently remove the demand.
Exactly, thereby reinforcing the very behavior you thought you were extinguishing. And furthermore, any extinction procedure causes a temporary spike in behavior known as an extinction burst.
It always gets worse before it gets better.
If you trigger an extinction burst without the clinical team knowing, without safety protocols in place, you put the client, yourself, and everyone in the room at risk of severe injury. You must never, ever test procedures independently.
The third mistake is one that touches on professional ethics, and it's a difficult one to confront: altering, estimating, or manipulating data. And we aren't just talking about malicious fraud here. Often this is born out of a misplaced sense of compassion.
We call it the compassion trap. Imagine you have been working with a non-vocal client for 8 months. You have an incredible bond. You know this client is highly intelligent, but they suffer from severe anxiety.
Okay.
During a direct assessment or a baseline probe for a new skill, the client just freezes up. They give you the wrong answer 10 times in a row. As the RBT, you know in your heart they know the answer. You've seen them do it off camera.
Oh, that's such a tough position.
It is. So when filling out the data sheet, you might think, I'm just going to mark a few of these as correct. I don't want the BCBA to think he's regressing. I want him to look good on his progress report.
It comes from a protective instinct. You want the client to succeed, but by doing that, you are actively destroying the client's clinical trajectory.
It is absolute data fraud, regardless of the intention. If you alter the data to show artificial mastery of a skill, the BCBA looks at that graph and assumes the foundation is solid. They will move the programming to the next, more complex level.
And the client isn't ready.
The client is now faced with advanced demands without possessing the prerequisite skills. They will experience massive frustration, the programming will fail, and behavioral issues will likely escalate.
So you hurt them by trying to help them.
Falsifying data doesn't protect the client. It abandons them to a fundamentally flawed intervention plan. Your data must reflect the brutal, objective reality of the moment, whether it looks good or bad.
Let's put the listener in the hot seat now. Instead of just listing off facts, I want to present some complex clinical scenarios, like exam questions. We are going to debate these situations, testing the boundaries of everything we've discussed. Let's start with question 1.
I'm ready.
What is a key difference between a functional analysis and a descriptive assessment? Is it A, a descriptive assessment involves manipulating variables, while an FA relies on observation? B, an FA experimentally demonstrates the maintaining variable by manipulating conditions, while a descriptive assessment generates hypotheses through correlational data? C, a descriptive assessment is a type of indirect assessment. Or D, an FA cannot be used for severe behaviors.
Well, the answer is B. An FA experimentally demonstrates the maintaining variable by manipulating conditions, while a descriptive assessment generates hypotheses through correlational data.
Right. And let's look at why the others are wrong. Option A is totally backwards.
Exactly. Option C is wrong because a descriptive assessment is direct observation, not indirect. And option D is a tricky distractor. While FAs for severe behavior are risky, they absolutely can be used with proper safety modifications, like a brief FA or precursor FA.
Perfect. Question 2. Which assessment relies on interviews and rating scales without direct observation? Is it A, descriptive assessment, B, functional analysis, C, direct assessment, or D, indirect assessment?
That one is D, indirect assessment.
That one is pretty straightforward.
It is.
Yes.
The key phrase there is without direct observation. If you're relying on someone's memory via an interview or rating scale, it is always indirect. Descriptive and direct are essentially synonyms here, and an FA is the most direct observation possible.
Okay, question 3. What is the RBT's primary role in a skill or functional assessment? A, to design the assessment procedures based on client history. B, to interpret the graph data to identify the function. C, to participate as directed, present materials, and objectively record responses. Or D, to independently test new interventions during the assessment phase.
The answer is C. to participate as directed, present materials, and objectively record responses.
And A, B, and D are exactly what we talked about as the most dangerous mistakes.
Yes. Designing procedures, interpreting data, and independent testing are all strictly the responsibility of the BCBA. If an RBT does any of those, they are violating their scope of practice.
All right, question 4, which is a scenario from mock exam, B. Why might a BCBA choose a descriptive assessment over a functional analysis for severe behavior? A, because an FA is less accurate. B, because an FA intentionally evokes the target behavior, which temporarily strengthens dangerous behavior and presents a risk. C, because descriptive assessments are required by insurance before an FA. Or D, because descriptive assessments experimentally prove causation without risk.
The answer is B. Because an FA intentionally evokes the target behavior, presenting a risk.
This goes back to our arson analogy.
Right. You don't hand an arsonist a match to test their motive if the house is going to burn down.
Yeah.
And FA is the most accurate, making A wrong. C is just a distractor. Insurance rules vary, but don't dictate the clinical science here. And D is incorrect because descriptive assessments do not prove causation.
Last one, question 5. An RBT writes in their notes, the client hit me because he was frustrated with the puzzle. Why is this incorrect? A, the RBT should have ignored the behavior. B, it uses subjective interpretation or mentalisms rather than objective, observable ABC data. C, the puzzle was not age-appropriate. Or D, the RBT did not record the time of the incident.
That is B. It uses subjective interpretation.
The mentalism trap.
Exactly. You can't see frustration. You can only see the hitting and the puzzle. Options C and D might be valid concerns in a broader context, but the fundamental error in the documentation itself is the mentalism.
This seamlessly transitions us into our ethics minute. We have touched on ethics organically, but let's really codify this against the professional standards. Under the RBT Ethics Code, specifically Section F.4, RBTs are mandated to operate within a defined, supervised scope of practice.
We really cannot overstate the importance of this. The behavioral sciences are incredibly powerful. When you manipulate reinforcement contingencies, you are altering a human being's behavioral repertoire.
That's a huge responsibility.
That power requires profound oversight. You implement BCBA-designed plans, you collect empirical data, and you report objective observations. Diagnosing a client, interpreting the results of an FA, and independently modifying a behavior intervention plan are explicitly and strictly outside your scope of practice.
If you step outside that scope, if you decide to play BCBA because you read a few articles or feel particularly confident you are violating the core principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, you are risking actual harm to a vulnerable individual.
And beyond the clinical harm, there are massive legal and regulatory implications regarding documentation covered under Section F.3. We discussed the compassion trap and altering data, but it also applies to omitting data or backfilling data.
Like trying to guess the data later.
Right. If you forget your iPad and decide to just guess what the ADC data was from memory 3 hours later, you are committing data fraud. Furthermore, all of this assessment data, the FAST interviews, the ABC charts, the FA graphs, constitutes protected health information.
APA applies to every scrap of paper and every digital note you take.
Absolutely. You cannot discuss the results of a client's functional assessment in a crowded clinic hallway.
Yeah.
You cannot leave a clipboard with ABC data sitting on the roof of your car.
Or texting your supervisor on a regular phone app.
Right. You cannot use insecure text messaging to tell your BCBA that the client had a massive spike in aggression during an escape condition. Confidentiality in the assessment phase is paramount because you are dealing with the most vulnerable behavioral details of a person's life.
Let's shift the lens a bit. Put yourself in the shoes of the supervising BCBA. When a supervisor comes out to the field to observe an RBT participating in an assessment, what exactly are they looking for? What separates an average RBT from an exceptional one during this phase?
When I am supervising an RBT during an assessment, I am looking for two primary things: absolute objectivity and unwavering procedural integrity.
What does that look like in action?
An exceptional implementation looks like an RBT who has basically become a human sensor. They are taking real-time data that paints a flawless picture. If the client drops to the floor, the exceptional RBT doesn't write, had a tantrum. They write, client dropped to knees, struck forehead against linoleum floor 3 times, emitted high-pitched vocalizations, duration 42 seconds.
It reads like a scientific transcript.
Yes, and if we're running an FA, the exceptional RBT is a master of the script. If the protocol requires a 30-second break during the escape condition, they are silently counting or using a discrete timer.
They give exactly 30 seconds.
Not 20 seconds, because they are anxious to get back to work, and not 45 seconds because they got distracted. They execute the timing and the delivery of consequences with mechanical precision.
What makes a supervisor panic then? What does poor implementation look like?
Poor implementation is when the RBT bleeds their personal emotions or teaching habits into the assessment. Remember, during an assessment, we are testing the baseline reality of the behavior. We are not trying to teach a new skill.
Oh, that's a great point.
If an RBT is conducting a descriptive assessment and they constantly prompt the client to give the right answer to avoid a behavior, they are destroying the baseline data. They are masking the problem.
They're muddying the waters.
Exactly. Alternatively, if they're assisting an FA and they show visible frustration, sighing loudly when the client hits them, they're inadvertently contaminating the condition with social variables.
We have covered a massive amount of theoretical and practical ground today. To help synthesize this, I want to give the listeners a memory hack. When you are sitting for your exam or when you are in the clinic trying to remember the hierarchy of evidence, remember the acronym IDA.
I love this mnemonic.
No.
It perfectly maps the continuum of assessment methods, from the least precise to the most scientifically rigorous.
Think of ID as climbing a ladder of proof. The I stands for indirect. This is interviewing. There is no watching involved. You are just talking, relying on memory, using rating scales like the FAST or QABF. It gives you a starting point.
Just the clues.
Right. The D stands for descriptive. This is directly watching. You are observing the client in their natural ecosystem, collecting ABC data, spotting the correlational patterns with your own eyes.
The stakeout.
Yes, the stakeout. And the A stands for analysis. This is actually testing. You have moved into the experimental phase, systematically manipulating the environment through specific conditions to achieve scientific proof of causation.
The sting operation.
Exactly. Idea. Interviewing, directly watching, actually testing.
It is a brilliant way to anchor the concepts. If you understand the difference between those three steps, you understand the architecture of behavioral assessment.
Let's bring it all home with a rapid review. Synthesize this entire expansive deep dive into 5 critical takeaways for the practitioner in the field.
All right, let's distill this. Number 1, an FBA, or functional behavior assessment, is not a single test. It is a comprehensive, multi-tiered, systematic process used to uncover the why, the maintaining variables behind a problem behavior.
Perfect.
Number 2, the process relies on 3 distinct methods. Indirect assessment, gathering historical data through interviews and scales without observation. Descriptive assessment, gathering correlational data through direct, real-time observation in the natural environment. And functional analysis, gathering causal data through experimental manipulation.
The IDA lab.
Exactly. Number 3, descriptive assessments, while vital for capturing natural environmental variables, only reveal correlational patterns. Because they do not control for hidden variables, they cannot definitively confirm the function of a behavior.
Correlation does not equal causation.
Always remember that. Number 4, a functional analysis is the gold standard for confirming function because it systematically triggers the behavior by manipulating antecedents and consequences, such as attention, escape, and alone conditions to isolate the exact cause. However, it must be used cautiously, especially with severe, dangerous behaviors.
Right. Don't hand an arsonist a match.
Exactly. And finally, number 5, the RBT's scope of practice is strictly supportive. Your role is to act as the objective eyes and ears of the assessment. You collect pristine data, and you may assist in experimental conditions exactly as directed. You are the foundation of the process, but you must never interpret data, diagnose functions, or design assessment procedures independently.
Beautifully summarized. If you internalize those 5 points, you will not only conquer task list item B3, but you will elevate the clinical standard of every team you work with.
You really become an indispensable asset because your data can be trusted implicitly.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over during your next shift. We talked a lot today about the urge to play detective, the urge to guess the why the moment a behavior occurs.
It's so tempting.
It is. Human empathy drives us to want to understand and fix things immediately. But true clinical empathy, the kind that leads to lasting, effective interventions, requires patience and scientific rigor.
It requires you to slow down.
Yes. Next time you are sitting in a session watching a complex behavior unfold, catch yourself in the act of assuming. When you feel the urge to write down they were frustrated or they just wanted attention, take a breath. Step back. Ask yourself, am I documenting the observable physics of this room? Or am I projecting my own narrative onto the client?
That's a powerful question to ask yourself.
Fight the urge to jump to conclusions. Stay ruthlessly objective. Let the raw data tell the story. and let the science of behavior analysis do the heavy lifting.
It is the hardest part of the job, but it's also the most crucial. The X-ray machine of behavior analysis isn't broken. It just requires a highly disciplined, objective technician to capture the image correctly.
We invite you to dive deeper into these concepts by reviewing your Amethyst Therapy Services study materials, specifically focusing on Domain B. Engage with the case studies, review the nuances of procedural integrity, and keep climbing that ladder of proof. Thank you so much for joining us for your dedication to the science, and we will see you on the next deep dive.